Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizers for their kind invitation, and thank you, Daniele, for hosting this session. I'm going to tell you about vision, and one of my favorite experimental paradigm to study vision is this one, and I hope you can all see the videos here. So just to give you a preview or some sense of what to expect, you're going to see images here on the left flash very briefly. And so the rule of the game is essentially for visual observer, visual participants to report the presence or absence of a particular category of objects. In this case, for instance, reporting whether they saw an animal or not. And so here images are flashed, somewhere around 100 milliseconds or so. In the lab, we could make this task, way faster. We could flash images for, a dozen or so milliseconds. And probably, given the latency, the bandwidth, I don't know what the quality of those images are for you, but again, in a lab setting, actually, interestingly, participants report typically not to see anything at all because it goes so fast. But we ask them to, and we force a response from them, and sure enough, they respond much more accurately than chance, probably around 80–90%, as to whether they saw an animal or not in those images. And so what is revealing about this particular experimental paradigm is that, as we all know, vision is a very complex function. The underlying visual dynamics is quite complex, yet we can push the visual system to its temporal limit with this kind of rapid categorization paradigm. And when we do so, obviously people start making mistakes. The visual system is operating in a very kind of impoverished context and environment. But we can study vision at its core. We can study the base representation that are being built by our visual system before more complex visual routines takes place, before we can move our eyes, shift of attention, etc., etc. Obviously, not only are human observers able to solve this complex rapid visual categorization task, but it's also quite possible to train primates, and monkeys in particular, to solve this task. I'll just show you here a quick demo where you see a monkey here. This is work done in the lab of Denis Fiz in Toulouse, where they were able to train monkeys to solve these kinds of tasks. Here it goes so fast that probably, at the frame rate that we're getting through Zoom, you're probably not even able to see the image, but the monkeys have no problems solving this task. And in fact, potentially because their brain are about 50% smaller than our own brains, they tend to be about 50% faster than humans on this task. So what are the computational mechanisms underlying our ability to solve this rapid visual categorization task? The past several decades of work in visual neuroscience have pointed to a set of visual areas that fall along a particular anatomical section of our visual system known as the ventral stream of the visual cortex, which starts from the back of your head and runs laterally towards the side of your head. Starts at the level in the cortex, at the level of the primary visual cortex, runs through secondary visual area V4, and then culminate at the level of the inferior temporal cortex, or IT cortex. Again, I don't know how many of the people here in the audience know about vision, but I think most people are familiar with the underlying kind of ideas behind the set of neuroscience facts that the past several decades of neuroscience work have revealed. We know that throughout this ventral stream, the visual signal undergo a series of transformations whereby the visual representations get more and more complex. The preferred stimulus or the preferred selectivity of neurons get more and more complex, starting with something like flash of spots of lights in very early visual areas like the lateral geniculate nucleus and the output of the retina. We find like orientation selectivity for bars and gradings in the primary visual cortex, and then as we get into higher and higher areas of the ventral stream, one can start finding neurons selective for more and more complex stuff, like parts of objects, textures, and maybe for those objects that are ecologically important, entire objects like faces, body parts, and things of that sort. And then in parallel to this gradual increase in the complexity of the preferred representation comes a gradual increase in the invariance properties of the representation. So neurons not only are becoming selective for more and more complex stuff, but they do so in a way that is increasingly more invariant to 2D transformations. So why do we care about those ultra-rapid or rapid visual categorization tasks? Our visual system contains both feed-forward and feedback connections. So feed-forward connections run from lower visual areas onto higher visual areas. I'll tell you a little bit more in just a second about feedback connections, but feedback connections will run recurrently within local visual areas, as well as top-down from higher onto lower visual areas. And so while certainly we know that feedback connections play a critical role in visual processing, we know that given the speed and the latency and the onset of category information that can be decoded from visual areas, we know that at least to account for this rapid visual categorization task, potentially feedback mechanisms play a very minimal role. That potentially these core visual representations, this core ability to solve rapid visual categorization would rely primarily on a single feed-forward sweep of activity from the retina through this ventral stream all the way to your hand pressing a button. Then just something to keep in mind when we look at the anatomy and physiology of the visual system, it's not easy to come up with an approximation of the number of processing stages, but I think most people, most visual neuroscientists would agree that somewhere around 5 to 8 processing stages is what is needed for the visual system to solve this rapid categorization type of problems. Again, throughout the years, we've had a zoo of computational models. I'm sure you've heard about neocognitron, things like VisNet, SpikeNet. I did my PhD at MIT where I contributed to the development of a particular class of computational model known as HMAX. The details don't really matter. What I think is an interesting kind of success story for computational neuroscience is that globally, this class of model has been able to account for a host of experimental data. And those models are feed-forward hierarchical models, and interestingly, they rely on, or they use only 4 operations in order to account for experimental data: linear filtering, followed by nonlinear rectification, some form of divisive normalization, and some form of pooling. And just stacking these 4 operations, in a feed-forward manner through a cascade of those processing stages has been sufficient to account for a host of anatomical, physiological data. And then ultimately, and this was part of the focus of my PhD thesis, we've been able to show that when we train those models to solve this rapid animal and animal categorization task, we could account well for experimental data, human psychophysics data of the kind that I alluded to earlier. So in a sense, it seemed that we had kind of a nice story from computational neuroscience. We understand fairly well the anatomy, physiology of our visual system. We can replicate this knowledge or summarize this knowledge into computational models that we can then simulate. And when we simulate them, we can then not only be consistent with the actual physiology, but also account for this high level kind of behavior such as visual image categorization. Now, most of the models that I mentioned were models developed, throughout the 90s and maybe, years 2000. We are in the era of deep learning. So fast forward, 10 years later, we're in the midst of this deep learning revolution. The ability of computer vision systems and in particular this deep neural network, as we know, increased dramatically. Obviously, one thing that has been powering this progress has been the rapid gains we have made in computing power. So what I'm showing here on the left is an example of a TPU, I believe, from Google, which is this kind of AI accelerator developed by Google. And of course, there are many others, including GPUs. And so this increase in computational power combined with very large data sets has really allowed computer vision scientists to develop systems that perform orders of magnitude better than this early kind of models of the visual system from 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, if we look at one of the main ingredients that has accounted for this progress in the field, what I'm showing here is a plot corresponding to the, so the height of the bars correspond to error rates. So this is for a kind of a main computer vision challenge, which involved a data set called ImageNet. I'm sure most of the people here have heard about it. Every year people submit, their or run their system, and then, there's a winner. And so what you see here, the height of the bars correspond to the error rate of the winning architecture for that year. The x-axis correspond to the year of the competition, and then the name of the winner. So what's pretty clear is that over the past, since 2010, and especially since 2012, when the first, sorry, let me try to, since the introduction of the first kind of deep neural network, which was AlexNet with 8 layers of processing, the accuracy or the error rate, I should say, has been going down steadily. I should point out that the 2016 was the last year that the competition was held. The data set is still being used in computer vision research, but 2016 is considered a landmark year because that's the first year that the systems achieved human level accuracy. And I'm not talking about human level accuracy on speeded visual presentation, as I showed you in my introduction, but I'm really talking about, allowing humans and giving humans all the time in the world to categorize images. And, we're at the level where the systems really match the level of accuracy of human observers. Perhaps more interestingly is to look at what's happening with this red plot here, red lines, which indicates the number of layers of the winning architecture that year. And so you see that we start with about 8 layers of processing with the AlexNet, and then years after years, there's a very clear trend whereby the best neural architectures end up getting deeper and deeper, to the point where, modern days, I would say, deep convolutional neural networks are typically ensembles of networks that are themselves hundreds of layers deep. So this is equivalent to, if not hundreds, maybe even thousands layers of processing. And if you do this, really impressive things happen. I think, none of the people that I know, and certainly not myself, but people who have been doing computer vision for the past 20 years or so, I don't think would have seen this coming. The progress has been staggering. I just mentioned that, modern computer vision systems are probably already outperforming humans on this ImageNet 1,000-way image classification. Facial recognition has followed a very similar trend. We have bigger and bigger data sets. Today, these data sets contain millions of individuals. Those neural networks can discriminate between millions of people at accuracies that are in the 90% or so of accuracy. And in fact, a study from a few years ago led by Jonathan Phillips, who is the person who has been working for the American government, who has been keeping track of the accuracy of leading facial recognition system for the past probably 20 or 30 years. And for the first time, the study has shown that the state of the art in facial recognition, the systems not only outperform you and I, kind of naive facial recognizers, but they can even compete with the best human facial recognizers we have, who are facial forensic experts. So people who recognize faces on a daily basis. So I think this is really, really impressive progress we've seen in the field. And yet, I think with all the excitement surrounding deep learning, the limitations of the systems is becoming increasingly more obvious. And so one of the key limitations, in my opinion, is the ability or the lack of ability of these systems to deal with novel unknown degradations. And so I showed an example here on the right. This is a figure that I took from an old paper by Pavan Sinha, published in Nature Neuroscience many years ago. But I think it illustrates the robustness of our own visual system very well. So If you're old enough to know the people that are shown on these images, and when I show that to my undergrads, the most of them miss the point that I'm trying to make because they don't know the people, but hopefully most of us here know these people. And so what is fascinating here is that you've potentially never seen those faces at such a low resolution. I think this is a 10 by 10 or 8 by 8 pixel here, and yet you can still recognize those faces. I'm quite sure that you've never seen, faces at such a low level of, such a high level, such a low frequency. And maybe even more impressive are those faces that have been stretched vertically. I'm quite sure that there is no way for you to have been exposed to those transformations naturally, and yet your visual system has this ability to somewhat undo the transformation and still recognize the faces. And I can guarantee you we've done that kind of casually. We don't have anything published, but if you take any of these leading facial recognition systems that are outperforming human observers on those facial recognition tasks, they would fail miserably on any one of those transformations. This is also true in the case of object recognition. There's a more systematic study published a few years ago at NeurIPS by Garros and colleagues. And so they showed that, again, if you establish a baseline from human observers during this rapid categorization task, take your favorite deep neural network, they will outperform, so they were human observers. They call that superhuman performance. You can even degrade those images. You can apply very severe amount of Gaussian noise. And again, if you train the systems on those degradations, they will outperform human observers. But here's the catch here. If now you make a tiny little change between the kind of noise applied between training and test, and so here, I don't know what your screen resolution will be, but this is salt and pepper noise here used for training on the left. This is Gaussian noise used for test. Even at a high resolution, those two types of noise are almost identical to a naked human eye, and yet that's enough to put this deep neural network at chance level, from superhuman level when trained on those degradations to chance level when they are not trained on. Okay, so neural networks, modern day deep neural networks, have this uncanny ability to really almost kind of rote memorize the source of noise, or learn to deal with the source of noise that is present in their training data. But I think it's fair to say that they exhibit very limited ability to generalize beyond the training data, and certainly to generalize to the kinds of image degradations that they haven't seen during training. And just to open a parenthesis, I think this is one of the main reasons that we don't have self-driving cars at the moment. We have companies driving, around the world, collecting, humongous data sets, potentially, billions of labeled data, including all kinds of bootstrapping methods to really incorporate errors produced by those systems. But the visual world is just too large. There is never a training data set that is large enough to encompass all possible combinations of objects and their degradations, all the possible visual illusions, et cetera, et cetera. Here's an example, perhaps a little bit more personal, and something that I'm very interested in is the so-called area of visual reasoning. So a very simple example of a visual reasoning ability would be the ability to learn to judge whether two or more shapes presented on the screen are the same or different. There's a whole cognitive science literature. This is something that animals, even bees, newborn ducklings can do from birth. And so we wanted to ask whether modern day visual deep neural networks can learn visual reasoning, such a visual reasoning task. So the same different judgment. So there's a whole lot of systems that have been developed for visual question answering, which is closely related. So the idea is that those are systems that are trained to answer questions based on images that are given to them. So you can ask them, how many pizzas are in the image, or what's on the right of the dog, what is the dog sitting on, and so on and so forth. But the kind of dirty little secret is those computer vision systems, those deep neural networks, are always trained and tested on the same finite set, same vocabulary of shapes. So here's an example of a popular data set used in visual question answering known as sort of clever. So it's a data set made of simple geometric shapes, circles, square, different colors. And so you can really evaluate the systems to answer all kinds of questions based on, toy world made of those shapes. But even though the systems are trained and tested on different samples, we realize that they're always trained and tested on samples derived from the same basic dictionary of shapes. And so my students ran a very simple experiment. They took what was at the time a state-of-the-art system for visual question answering. And so they train it to solve a same different task. So of course, the systems are never given the rule. They have to discover the rule from training data. And so if you train and test the system on the same set of shapes, you find that, if you wait long enough, they can certainly learn that. And by long enough, I mean, several hundreds of thousands of presentations. However, if we keep one single combination of shape and color out of the training data set, for instance, we train them on science and we train them on circles, maybe no science circle, we keep that combination out for tests, then we find that the system never generalizes to this left out condition. In other words, literally learn, or I like to say rote memorize statistical associations between visual features and abstract rules, but they never really generalize beyond the visual appearance of those objects. Okay. And of course, this is in sharp contrast with the way animals learn to solve this task. What I showed here as an illustration is a study published in Science a few years ago, where they showed that they could take completely newborn ducklings and use what is called the imprinting, which is a natural response of the animal. When the duckling is born, the duckling will imprint on the first thing more or less that it sees, which is normally the mother, but you can shortcut that function and then imprint or allow the animal to imprint on objects, or in this case pairs of shapes, either being pairs of same shapes or pairs of different shapes. And then later on, you can evaluate you can give two choices, two sets of shapes to the animal, and then evaluate their ability to exhibit or have learned the same different task. And what they showed is that the duckling could, from a single training example, right? We're not talking about the hundreds of thousands of training examples here, but from a single training examples, the duckling was able to generalize beyond color or shape. So that's, orders and orders of magnitude better than almost anything you could get from modern day deep neural networks. I'll skip the details. We've done a lot of work on this. I'll just give you like the high level summary. We have shown computationally that in order for deep neural networks to learn to solve this task, there is a very simple mechanisms that can allow them to do this. And it's just allowing them to, or spoon feed them with a visual scene that has been perceptually organized for them. In other words, they would need an ability to attend to individual objects and solve the so-called binding problems. So learn to associate features to objects held into memory, and not simply processing those images as one single kind of bag of visual features. Obviously, those functions, whether it's working memory or attention, relies on the cortical feedback that we know is present in our visual system. So just to give you a kind of a brief summary of what I've tried to tell you so far, we know that we have very successful deep feedforward neural networks, CNNs, that are solving tasks that we thought would be very hard for any kind of engineered system to solve, visual tasks, that is, but they have become orders of magnitude deeper than our own visual system. As I mentioned earlier, when we look at the number of processing stages in our visual system, we're probably close to half a dozen, maybe up to a dozen processing stages. And so the way our visual system is able to build some sort of a processing depth beyond this initial feedforward sweep is through reentrant signals, through feedback connections, right? So it's not just by processing statically through layers, but really allowing signals to reentrant, which provides an ability to compute or obtain depth through time through feedback connections. And so just maybe to give you a bit of terminology, I've been talking about feedforward connections, so running from lower onto higher visual areas. We also consider two kinds of feedback connections, what I'll refer to as top-down connections that run from higher level visual areas onto lower visual areas, as well as so-called horizontal, lateral, local recurrent connections, which runs within a processing stage. I'll tell you much more today about the role of horizontal connections, but hopefully if I have time, I'll tell you a little bit about top-down as we've done work involving both. So our starting point to try to extend this class of feed-forward hierarchical models to incorporate recurrent connections or feedback connections was really going back to square one and trying to really characterize low-level electrophysiology phenomena. And there's a whole list of phenomena that have been discovered and studied for the past several decades, which have to do with the so-called classical and extra-classical receptive fields phenomena. And I don't know how many of you have heard the term extra-classical receptive fields, but I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the notion of the classical receptive field, which is the part of the visual field that needs to be stimulated for a particular neuron to respond. What people refer to as the extra-classical receptive field is an area of the visual space that typically sits outside of right around the classical receptive field. If you just stimulate the classical receptive field by itself, by definition, it will not elicit any response from the neuron. Otherwise, it would be part of the classical receptive field. However, if the classical receptive field is already stimulated, if there's something presented to the classical receptive field, then we know that what is also presented in the extra-classical receptive field just outside will have a very strong modulatory effect on the neuronal response. So and that's perhaps the only math, sadly, that I'm going to be showing you here, and without getting into much detail, but there is a body of work that has suggested that this type of classical, extra-classical receptive field interactions rely on feedback connections, and in particular horizontal connections within neighboring neurons. And maybe something that I need to tell you, for those who are not familiar with the anatomy and physiology of the visual system, your visual system, and especially earlier areas of the visual system, are organized retinotopically and according to cortical columns. So you should think of those columns as each containing potentially hundreds, thousands of neurons with different selectivity. For instance, a range of neurons spanning all possible orientation tuning, or maybe all possible spatial frequency tuning, all possible color opponency tuning, so on and so forth. But typically, they will include an entire battery of feature selectivity for that particular visual area. And then a particularity of neurons within cortical columns is that they all share the same receptive field. So the receptive fields are all centered at the same position in your visual field. And then those columns get replicated, right? Essentially, they're going to tile your entire visual field. And so it is assumed that the pattern of connectivity between neurons, between nearby columns, are the main drivers behind this kind of classical, extra-classical receptive field phenomena. So a few years ago, we developed I would say dynamical system type of model to try to characterize the interactions between neurons within cortical columns and across cortical columns. So these are the equations describing the system. I just put them there because I know that there are mathematicians in the audience. I'm not going to tell you very much except to say that this is building on a long history of work. People like Steve Grossberg, Sebastian Song, and many others. So these are systems of differential equations. You typically have, for every neuron, you're going to have one set of differential equations for governing the excitation to that neuron from horizontal connections, separate differential equation for the inhibition. And then the important thing here is maybe that, those stars correspond to convolutions. So we are modeling horizontal interactions as a 3D tensor. And so the assumption is that the same kind of kernel or tensor applies at every location and governs the interactions between neighbors. And so now, because of a large number of cortical columns spanning your visual field, we end up with, a very large number of differential equations to solve. Historically, we used to use, very simple method like Euler integration. But 2 points. One is that it ends up being fairly computationally intensive to simulate these kinds of models. And they are not very prone to learning and to optimizing the synaptic weights. And I'll get back to that in a second. Second of all, though, is that, once you have populations of neurons or entire, layers of processing endowed with this kind of dynamics, you can have very interesting, phenomena that arise. In particular, neurons can now communicate from one end of an image all the way to the other end of an image, right? As opposed to, purely feed-forward model where the only way for neurons to incorporate increasingly large amount of context would be through feed-forward processes. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you anything else about the model. This is all published. All I'll say is that the particular pattern of connectivity, which is, this tensor here, is an interesting piece. Everything was done by, what we call graduate student descent. So I had a graduate student spending several months of his life looking for electrophysiology studies, trying to find constraint on the pattern of synaptic weights and the kinds of operations we should bake into the model. We ended up with 3 key mechanisms to account for this set of phenomena. We had to assume that the interactions between nearby columns is excitatory, where those columns are nearby. Past a critical distance, the interaction switches from excitatory to inhibitory. So neurons that are near excite each other, neurons that are far inhibit each other. Across cortical columns, the connections have to be tuned. So only units with the same selectivity are connected. So if you're a neuron here tuned to vertical orientation, then you're going to be connected to your neighbors, if and only if they are also tuned to a vertical orientation. And then the third key mechanism required in this model was the requirement that, unlike excitation that could be linear, inhibition had to be nonlinear, of the so-called shunting type, if people are familiar with this, or what we also more casually refer to as divisive normalization. And then if you do this, obviously, you start having interesting interactions between and across cortical columns. Again, I could spend a whole talk describing the myriad of interactions that we've identified. But just to give you a flavor for those, I'm just going to show you a particular kind of interactions when we present gradings, for instance, with different orientation in a center column and a far surrounding column. And so just to give you a preview of what I'm going to show you next, you're going to see neural population responses. So think of the x-axis as being neurons or orientation, preferred orientation. Where here in this case, here would be 0 degree, maybe purely vertical. And then the height of the bar would be proportional to the response of the neuron with that preferred selectivity. So here, if you present a vertical bar in the center, you will find a whole neural population response kind of peaking at the center orientation and then kind of falling off around. The orientation here in the surround is tilted to the right. So we obtain a very qualitatively similar response. Again, this is a toy example, but I'll show you the simulation in a second, except that now because the surround is tilted slightly to the right, we see that the population response is shifted slightly to the right. Now, remember that we have this like-to-like pattern of horizontal connections between our center and surrounding columns. And combined with this nonlinear divisive type of inhibition, that means that This guy here in the surround, which has a higher response than this guy here in the surround, is really going to try to push this guy down. This guy here is also going to try to push this guy down, but maybe a little less because its own level of activity is less. But anyway, the point is that there's going to be potentially some very complex interactions between population of neurons in one columns and nearby columns, and depending on what represents in the center, in a reference column, and in the centering, and in the surrounding, in the surround of that central position, we're going to have very complex interactions. So here's an example of an actual simulation. Oh, sorry, it looks like my movie is not playing. Okay, I don't know. I'm sorry about that. It looks like I'm having some trouble playing the video. This is Google Slide. Well, you'll have to trust me on that. What I was going to show you is an actual simulation of the dynamical system model when we present exactly this kind of center surround stimuli. When the orientation of the surround is tilted away from that of the center, you would have seen populations of neurons for the center and surrounds kind of going up and down and kind of working potentially here against one another, where in the end, the surrounding, the activity from the surround through inhibition ends up pushing away the center column. And so when we train a decoder to predict the orientation of the center, we find that we can essentially shift the perception of the neural, oracle decoder in the center based on what we put in the surround. And we found that in practice, this model was able to account for a host of contextual illusions. So the one that I just presented is a well-known one called the tilt illusion. Those things are, dependent on the spatial frequency, on the viewing distance. So it may or may not work, for individual viewers here, but, please trust me. These are standard kind of very well-known visual illusions. So the tilt illusion is interesting because when the surround is tilted just a little bit from the center, you should see here this vertical grading tilted a little bit to the left. So the surround kind of repels the center. Past a critical angle, the effect reverses. If the difference between the center and the surround increase past the threshold, then the surround starts attracting the center. And again, this may or may not work for you. And we found that this model was able to account qualitatively very well for this. And then when we switch the input neural populations, we can switch from orientation to color to motion, etc. We're able to show that the same exact circuit was able to account for a host of the so-called contextual illusions, including contextual illusions involving color, motion, etc., etc. So I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. All of this is published, and I will encourage you to look at the paper if anybody is interested in the details. What I want to spend the last 10 minutes or so that I have is to tell you about how it is now possible, how it's how some of the more recent work we've done has been essentially trying to move away from this kind of more classical continuous dynamics type of dynamical system models to leveraging modern tools from deep learning, gradient-based methods to really learn to optimize the circuits so that they can be embedded into deep neural network and trained to solve complex visual tasks. And so, as I said earlier, one of the challenge dealing with differential equations, as I'm sure many of you here know, is that it's or at least a few years ago, it was not really amenable to learning. And so all of the tweaking, all of the setting of the operations, whether you want linear, nonlinear operations, if you want particular pattern of synaptic weights, etc., all of that had to be tweaked by graduate student descent. Now, with all the bells and whistles that people have kind of discovered, working on modern day recurrent neural networks. I'm sure many of you have heard about LSTM, gated recurrent units. They have all these gates, and that really allows those discrete time approximation of this recurrent neural circuit to learn very efficiently, and in particular to be trained to solve very complex tasks. And so we've done essentially that. We've started from very popular recurrent neural network module called the gated recurrent unit, and we've used that to approximate our contextual circuits, approximating separate populations of excitatory and inhibitory neurons, taking into account this nonlinear divisive interactions and so on and so forth. And throughout the years, we've, starting from our relatively simple circuit of just horizontal connections, we've extended the approach to to also incorporate with the same basic set of equations, top-down connections, so an ability to propagate information from a higher level units onto lower level units. And then more recently, again, adding more and more complexity as the need arises when we try to solve more and more complex visual reasoning tasks. And then to evaluate the ability of modern deep neural network models, or I should say their inability to solve complex visual reasoning tasks, we've been developing an array of visual reasoning challenges. For the most part, they have been motivated by fairly standard cognitive psychology tasks. I'll show you a few examples, but that have been used to study human vision for decades now. And we've been able to adapt those simple human psychophysics tasks to kind of automated procedural generation, so that we could generate hundreds of thousands or millions of training data to really be able to evaluate modern day deep neural network architecture. So those are just representative tasks. I thought that I would spend most of my time telling you about one task that I think really highlights the benefit of feedback connections, recurrent connections relatively well. So we call this task the Pathfinder. So what you see here are, so on the top row here are positive, bottom row are negative examples. So you should see contours made of little paddles. And then on both the positive and negative examples, you should see two markers. I don't know if, again, depending on the resolution, there is one here and one here. So on the positive examples, the markers fall on the same contour. On the negative examples, they fall on two different contours. So think of this task as training system to find a path. And the question really is a binary one. Is there a path going from point A to point B? The learners have to discover that task from just positive and training examples. So we can parameterize, this task in a number of ways, changing the orientation, the distance of the paddles, etc. One particular parameterization we thought that would make the life of feedforward neural network particularly hard is when we start making those contours longer and longer. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned earlier, in a feedforward neural network, the only way for units or neurons to communicate and incorporate increasingly more context or discovering increasingly long-range spatial dependencies is going, up, right? And by building increasingly large receptive field. And so the assumption here is that, we know that feedforward neural network or universal approximators, they should, be able to solve the task if they are deep enough and if we give them enough training examples. And here we can generate tens of millions of those. But our prediction was that feedforward neural network would need to have, or to be able to build receptive field that encompass the entire contours, right, to be able to solve the task. And so the prediction was that the minimal depth required for a feedforward neural network to solve the task should increase as we make the lengths of the contours longer and longer, if that makes sense. Because those feedforward neural network build, receptive field size through depths. And so because they need larger and larger receptive fields, the minimum depths needed to solve, longer and longer version of the tasks is that they should get deeper and deeper. I hope I was clear enough on that. In comparison, if you have a recurrent neural network with an ability to communicate, for units to communicate within a layer of processing, through local exchange of information, then in theory, a single layer of this recurrent network should be sufficient to solve the task. In fact, a very natural way to solve the task is what we call incremental grouping. All is needed is a unit to essentially discover one of the marker and then spread activity to the neighbor along the contour, and then incrementally spread activity until the end of the contour is reached. And then the question is, is there a marker or not at the end of that contour? And so here's our results. Sorry, let me try to move my Zoom if I'm blocking anybody's view. So this is a very complex plot. I'm not gonna go through all the details. I'll just say that every one of those cells, I'll draw your attention to the top row. I'll just say that if you look at individual cells, there should be 3 dots, each corresponding to the accuracy of a particular class of models for the 3 different lengths. So just to get it out of the way, we can take our recurrent neural network module, again, single layer. We can optimize it for the task, and it learns to solve the task for all three contour lengths. We can try to do this with standard convolutional neural network. They really struggle. We had good results with ResNets, which are much more efficient at learning. You can take a ResNet of any depth, and it can learn to solve the shorter version of the task, so pass length 6 and 9, shown here. But then as soon as you reach the 14 lengths, their accuracy essentially falls down to chance. You need to go all the way to 152 layers of processing for those neural network to be able to solve the task. So they really learn that through kind of brute force rather than through a much more generalizable and easily graspable strategy. We are replotting those results here in the lower left for the longer contour lengths. On the x-axis is the number of free parameter multiplier. The y-axis is the accuracy. We call it HGRU as in horizontal gated recurrent unit. This is our recurrent neural network. It does perfect accuracy with the best sample efficiency. You can also get pretty good accuracy with feedforward neural network, but it's going to take you orders of magnitude more training data. Okay. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe just before I run out of time, just to convince you that this is not just a cute task that came out of the head of cognitive scientists. Interestingly, DeepMind a couple of years ago, back into 2020, developed a challenge for to evaluate modern transformer networks. So I hope most of you have heard about transformer networks. They have taken the field in natural language processing. They are taking over computer vision. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but they're really, taking over AI. And so DeepMind researchers have created this challenge, which includes a number of tasks. They are not all visual, some are textual, etc. But they included our Pathfinder data challenge. And they try to train all the greatest and latest transformer architecture. And what you see here is that, this is not our work. This is DeepMind. They were not able to train any of the leading transformer network, even with 20 million training examples, to solve what would seem otherwise like a trivial task. This is just binary images, black and white pixels, etc. That's what they call PathX. To be able to train the architecture on the task, they had to downsample very massively from 128 by 128 down to 32 by 32. At that resolution, they were able to train transformer networks, but the accuracy of these networks, they can be trained, but they're in the 70 something percent, when just a single layer of our recurrent neural network would solve the task perfect. All right, so I'm not going to have time to tell you much more. I'll just say that one question that I used to get is if recurrent neural network, if feedback connections are so great, why is the state of the art in computer vision all feedforward networks? We postulated that it had to do with the way those networks are trained. Recurrent neural network are trained, the standard way would be to use backpropagation through time. The challenge with those this training approach is that you have a linear increase in the memory cost as you want this network to allow them to have more and more time points for computing. Because feedforward neural networks already take up most of the memory available on the GPU, then you don't really have enough time and enough power to really allow those dynamical systems to shine through a large number of computation through time. So we developed an extension of what is called contrastive recurrent backprop. I won't have time to give you the details, but the main benefit of this learning approach is that we can use regularization methods to force our recurrent neural network to have a steady state. And then, once we can force a steady state, we can use the steady state to backpropagate the gradients, not for every time point, but just for the final time points. And that works great. You can take that simple single layer recurrent neural network, slap it on a leading feedforward neural network, and then train it through this method. And what you find is that you can really improve the state of the art in the domain of panoptic segmentation, which is closely related to semantic segmentation, if you haven't heard from it. We find that systems or feedforward systems embedded, extended with those feedback connections can really start to make, it's not just a quantitative improvement, but we find qualitative improvements. Many of the false classifications are now suppressed through those horizontal feedback connections. You see the system here at work. So again, the segmentation here is not done through static processing stages, but really by allowing units to communicate and exchange information. We do not tell the neural network what to do. It just discover this, what looks like a filling in or incremental grouping strategy. It seems to start at the center of mass of an object and then spread activity until it hits the boundary of the object. Interestingly, it seems to be somewhat consistent with strategies leveraged by human and established by psychophysics method. We've extended the approach to incorporate feedback. One of the main benefits is that of sample complexity. And then more recently, we've extended to the time domain and the addition of attentional circuits, which have allowed us to do really well in the domain of object tracking in videos. In fact, we were able to lead the leaderboard for one of the main visual tracking challenge known as TrackingNet. I think we were #1 when we published the work. We're now #2. But anyway, I apologize for going a little bit over time. Hopefully we still have a little bit of questions for for questions. What I hope I've told you or introduced is a new breed of feedback networks, which are inspired by cortical circuits found in the visual cortex. I've shown you that, actually I skipped that, but I wish I had time to show you that we can get feedforward neural network achieving the same level of accuracy as those feedback neural networks, but they need to get much deeper. They require much more training data. And when we do this, they do not exhibit the same sensitivity to contextual illusions as primates and humans in particular do. We've been able to push the state of the art, adding those feedback mechanisms on feedforward architectures for contour detection, for panoptic segmentation, and for object tracking. And you know, I'm sure I'm preaching the choir here. That's something that I've been trying to convince my computer vision colleagues, is that I really think that, you know, computer vision initially and deep neural network were somewhat grounded in visual neuroscience. The two fields, and computer vision in particular, seem to have largely diverged, or it seems to be diverging away from neuroscience. And I think there is still an opportunity for us neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, to reinject novel ideas for AI. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks for a very inspiring talk. We do have time for a couple of questions. In fact, one of them was asked in the middle of the talk, but it didn't have the heart to stop you. So the first question is from Heran. Thanks a lot. Coming from a computer science, he has two questions. First, with your square shape color experiment, did you try out spiking neural networks and see how they would perform? And two, what is a circuit model exactly? What each one of those triangular shapes represent? I think he's referring to the earlier part of the talk.
Yeah, so okay, let me just maybe to help provide some context, I'll share again. Yes, so I think question refers to my ducking example here. Yeah, so I mean, what I'm showing here is obviously an idealization, but you know, there's this data set called Sort of Clever, and so this is a standard data set in AI and computer vision, visual question answering, where there's something like, I think maybe a dozen shapes, triangles, squares, etc., different size. You know, they can vary in size and aspect ratio and these kinds of things. And then they are given a color, again, you know, so many colors, I don't know, half a dozen, a dozen. And so then, you know, the systems are typically trained to answer questions about the scenes, like what's on the right of the triangle, what's on the left of the square, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that, of course, the architectures are always trained and tested on the same dictionary of shapes. And so my student just took those architecture, and then just try to train them on a simplified version, which is just the same different task. We now train them with pairs of shapes. Shapes can be in any position, different scale, etc. And positive example, compare pairs of the same shape and color. Negative example contains shapes that are different. And so the learners have to discover that from training data. So I hope that clarifies the second part of the question. With respect to the first part of the question, I don't think it's a matter of spike or no spike, or I think it's a matter of going beyond template matching. That I think if you take a CNN, whether it's spiking one or not, really what it does is a glorified template matching. I would go as far as saying this is a giant lookup table, and the bigger the better apparently. And so I think what is needed for visual reasoning is something that is able to go beyond template matching, because if you haven't been trained, obviously you need to abstract away from shape, right? To demonstrate an ability to solve same different judgments, hopefully at some point the observer has to be able to solve the task for shapes never seen before. And obviously human observers can do that without any problem. I can show you an object that you've never seen before, two versions of it, or two different versions of two never seen before objects, and people will have no problem figuring out that they are the same different. What seems to happen in visual question answering is that the systems never really reach the level where they can exhibit this level of abstraction in ways that even ducklings can demonstrate. And so I don't think unless I'm there's something more about just spiking your network that I'm missing, but to some extent it's less about whether you spike or not, and it's really much more about having an ability to in this case build more abstract representations than just raw global visual representations of the whole scene. And so the kinds of things we have in mind, and we've done collaboration with experimental groups, we've done EEG studies that validated this hypothesis. I think what is needed is an ability to, for instance, bind visual representations, neural representations to objects. And essentially you want the system to attend to one of those shapes, build a visual representation for that object, push that into working memory, then shift attention to the other object, extract a representation of that object, and then learn. Now that the task becomes trivial, it becomes easy to learn the task. And in fact, we've shown that if we endow these kinds of ability to organize the scene perceptually, and what we did was very simple. We just took an image with those two shapes or multiple shapes, and split up the image into different channels, where each channel would contain a single object. So essentially, if you will, we solve the binding problem for the convolutional neural network because we allow it to process to process individual objects kind of independently. And if we do this, we find that the CNN can learn the task, almost, with very few training examples. So again, I think it's less about, spikes, no spikes, or better template matching. I think what this suggests is that, and perhaps what makes our visual system so robust and so sample efficient, is that we have an ability to organize the visual scene, which allows us in turn to build, higher level abstractions on top of visual representations that go beyond, the kinds of bag of word representations you'd be able to get with a convolutional neural network or equivalents.
I think there is time for another question. In fact, we have more than one. Perhaps you can then continue in the chat. But Moin is asking, thank you for the great talk. Have you examined the case of having branched contours or highly intersecting contours in the Pathfinder task? And how would the introduction of those, how would it affect the accuracy of the recurrent neural network?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So nothing is published, but we've started to look into that. In fact, we are very interested in, we've been looking into neural ODEs as ways to train some of those recurrent neural network. It is a very good question, because it is true that the complexity and the number of intersection along the contour is going to be actually a learning challenge. That there's going to be a direct correspondence between yeah, so every time there is a crossing, the learning algorithm, I mean, there's an ambiguity in terms of how to allocate or how to associate the gradient to the correct path, essentially. And so you're right. The more intersection, the more problematic it gets. It is especially a problem for backprop through time. We found that our contrastive recurrent backprop deals better with it, but this is still going to lead to more errors. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I don't have much more concrete to respond, but that's a very good point. There's a correspondence between the credit assignment problem and this occluding contours during learning.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think in the interest of time, I have to pass the baton to Etienne, who will lead the microtalk session. But thanks again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Daniele. I'm sure that everyone needs to work for 2 minutes now. So I suggest 2-minute breaks, no more than 2 minutes, but at least 2 minutes. So see you in 2 minutes for the microtalk session.